This video is sponsored by the Magnet Baron, the one-stop shop for all your hobby magnetization needs. More about them later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's August, a new month for Warhammer 40k 10th edition. Just last week, we got some updates to the edition in the index card errata. We changed a lot of very key balance changes, most notably to Aeldari and Genestealer Cults. I did a tier list at the beginning of the edition, but we've seen a lot of changes since then, including nerfs to the top factions, as bug fixes that I discussed earlier. So I thought that on the dawn of this new month, it would be an interesting opportunity to update that tier list and talk about the current power ranking of Warhammer 40k factions between now and the next balanced update. Now, while I expect to do these for each update, if we do see movement in the 40k metagame, and we have been seeing some dramatic changes within the competitive scape of the game, which I have been covering on my Monday videos discussing the best list in Warhammer 40k, if that continues on, I'd love to do these every couple weeks or every month or so, which would be super cool. As always, a couple caveats beforehand. A lot of this is personal experience and based on personal opinion, so if you don't necessarily agree with everything, go ahead and let me know down in the comment section what you would change in my tier list. And if you think I'm undervaluing any factions or any particular components of factions. As always, if you enjoy this style of Warhammer 40k content, please go drop a like in the video, subscribe on the channel, all the YouTube stuff. You know what's up? I'm going to be breaking down all the factions into one of 5 categories. Easy mode factions, the ones that will largely get you a win by virtue of their core mechanics, that still can lose games if you make some mistakes and don't have perfect matchups into the majority of the game, but are still relatively powerful. The fine factions are right in the middle of the road. They're pretty good, have some bad matchups, have some good matchups, and with some smart play can certainly compete even at the highest levels of competition, but generally speaking are going to struggle against the easy mode stuff. The math factions are basically in the same boat, but do have a wider variety of bad matchups. And last but certainly least, the bad factions have a tough matchup into basically everything in the game. So with that, let's dive in to this tier list and start at the bottom with the bad factions. The first one that we have is the Leagues of Votann. This one is just hilariously poorly designed. They have so many anti-synergistic mechanics constructed within the index that it feels like the designers really didn't want this faction to succeed. Things like their judgment tokens not meshing with mechanics like the heavy weapon ability that most of their heavy weapons have, giving them +1 to hit and counteracting the poor ballistic deal that the entire faction was saddled with. Their faction ability requires that your units be killed in order to generate judgment tokens on your opponent, which gives you buffs against them, but their units are all largely very expensive, and you don't want those units to be killed, and you want for as long as possible to get value from these units before they're killed, but that value is hard to get because their baseline stats assume that you've already gotten those judgment tokens on the opponent. Altogether, it creates a faction with a confused identity, poorly conceived mechanics, and just a bad set of rules that honestly maybe just needs a ground-up redesign. Adepta Sororitas is the next and are largely in the same boat. Well, unlike Leagues of Votann, they do have some good core stat lines, and they have some great units within their index, including small utility units that are incredible at scoring secondary objectives. Units like Seraphim, Crusaders, and Death Cult Assassins can slot into a Sororitas list and give you dozens of small units that can be used to score secondaries. The sisters that they're supporting, however, are the real problem, and the downside is that you're saddled by an index full of Strength 3 or Strength 4 weapons that don't really have any buffs. Just like Leagues of Votann, the design of Adepta Sororitas assumes that you have their faction abilities unlocked, and unfortunately for them, just like Leagues of Votann, their detachment roll does require their models to die, which are generally relatively elite and fairly expensive. The way the core mechanics of the game mesh with their detachment ability, which gives them a hit bonus when they've lost any models and a wound bonus when they're below half strength, is very bad, because that below half strength criteria requires that they lose more than half of their models, meaning in a 2-model unit, you'd have to lose more than 1 model, which would be 2 models, which would be the whole unit. Given that a lot of their units moved down from larger unit sizes like they had in 9th edition to 2 or 5 models, requiring them to either lose 3 models to trigger that +1 to wound effect or be dead, these just don't work with their detachment ability, and for the most part, their profiles get relatively pillow-fisted. They do have solid indirect fire with their exorcists. The Castigator is a functional battle tank, and some of their infantry is okay. They're definitely on an uphill struggle. And I think the most effective Sororitas lists actually have a minimum of Sororitas in them and rely very heavily on Imperial agents and Allied Knights, with the sisters mostly as support. Moving Moving on to Adeptus Mechanicus. These guys have less of an issue with their core functions, and it's more, I think, a problem of their stats related to their cost. While their detachment ability is probably the worst in the game, Rad Bombardment, dealing some mortal wounds to the opponent in exchange for maybe battle shocking them is very bad, but they can still support that with having an army ability that's fairly good. Being able to gain an AP increase and assault on a whim is pretty strong, and they have some decent units to back it up, with things like Skitarii Vanguard reducing enemy objective control, making them one of the best objective control units in the game, and Cataphron Breachers being an incredibly powerful frontline anti-tank beat stick that can also reactive fire to make multiple shots per battle round. That said, the cost of these models is extreme, and they are relying on these overlapping synergies, which are kind of tough to execute. And overall creates a faction that really struggles to do much besides get into a direct fire shooting match and lose to many of the more efficient armies in the game. Are you gearing up for Warhammer 40k's 10th edition, but unsure of what war gear you want your units to be equipped with? With a new rule set for the game comes a ton of new challenges, and it's hard to be prepared for everything. You've got new opposing armies to play against, new enemy units to contend with, and a quickly changing metagame. Maybe you're worried about erratas impacting your models or the loadouts you've assembled them with. Well, I have an easy solution for you, and that is magnets. And the easiest way to access that easy solution is the Magnet Baron, your one-stop shop for all of your model modularity needs. Modularity needs. Nailed it. The Magnet Baron is the best place to go to get your armies ready for playing within the new edition. They offer magnetization sets for a wide variety of Warhammer 40k model kits that includes the specific components that you need to magnetize them and allow them to build in any loadout available. So your units can remain flexible without having to break the bank buying additional bits or extra models. Not only that, but the Magnet Baron also includes a wide variety of other useful gaming accessories, including sturdy flight stands that don't snap as soon as you take them out of the box, convenient movement trays for moving large units around, as well as a wide variety of hobby magnets in a frankly ridiculous selection of shapes and sizes. So you can modulate any bit for any model and any part of your collection. So check them out at themagnetbaron.com to get your army ready for the new edition of Warhammer 40k and remain flexible as the game develops. Moving on to the next tier, we have the math factions. These guys are at the bottom edge of the middle of the road. Really, where Games Workshop wants most of the factions to be in the game are within a 45 to 55% bracket, and these guys are, they're pushing the 45% edge of that Goldilocks zone. We're starting this one with Death Guard. These guys are pretty sad, especially compared to their previous editions, where they had some incredible defensive mechanics. Now, their defensive abilities are fairly mediocre, but they can supplement that by being able to bring a relatively okay gun line. Units like Plagueburst Crawlers and Myphitic Blight Haulers alongside Blightlord Terminators with attached characters can be the core of a functional army. The real problem is that they're incredibly slow and do not play missions well whatsoever. They have a tough time getting to objectives. Once there, they have a tough time holding those objectives, and when they're drawing tactical objective cards, they have a tough time scoring those as well, with extremely limited access to fast or maneuverable units. On top of that, they do have a little bit of anti-synergy within their core mechanics. Their Gift of Nurgle reduces the toughness value of enemies that are around them or that they affect them with, but most of their weapons have lethal hits, which then ignores the toughness of your opponent. Definitely could use another pass here. They kind of feel a little bit like Leagues of Votann, except that their guns are actually good and not like wildly overcosted. Moving on, we have Drukhari. These guys, unfortunately, are a little bit confused. Drukhari are one of the premier flighty and fighty factions in Warhammer 40k traditionally, being a fast, hard-hitting, transport-oriented melee force, but in 10th edition lacking basically any melee weapons whatsoever. Being a largely strength 3, low AP, low damage faction means that there's very few profiles you actually want to get into melee even if you can. And with the new changes to the fly rules, making it so that flying vehicles must now traverse over intervening terrain rather than just being able to functionally ignore it when moving, means that a faction entirely based around delivering models with flying vehicles is just dead on arrival. That said, Drukhari can make a pretty respectable gun line out of taking tons of anti-tank weapons or high-volume attack weapons and buffing them with recycling pain tokens to give them massive numbers of hit rerolls. This makes them extremely accurate, if extremely fragile. And while their efficiency when it comes to the delivery of anti-tank weapons like Dark Lances is probably some of the best in the game on a points per shot basis, that alone doesn't really create a good faction. And while they are fast and they can complete tactical secondaries fairly well, a lot of that speed comes from their transports, which again, they then have to pay out the nose for and are a little bit restricted on how they move them because they're going to be having to go around terrain. Drukhari honestly find a second lease on life with Ynnari being able to be taking them in an Eldar detachment. We're not talking about their function as an ally, but I do think that if we see some significant nerfs to the core Eldar super faction, Drukhari plus Eldar could actually be a pretty functional archetype. Moving on to the next one, we have World Eaters. These guys are a melee-only faction in an edition that strongly discourages melee attacks.
Don't hit people.
And that is not a great place to be, if I'm being honest. It is an unfortunate time for the Sons of Angron, because these guys went from being one of the most interestingly balanced and high-scoring armies in 9th edition to basically being a big do-nothing in 10th edition. While they can project some ridiculous threat ranges if they roll correctly on their Blessings of Khorne, and they can actually make that fairly reliable with the application of enhancements in some of their units, being able to re-roll or roll additional Blessings of Khorne dice, the overall effect is, again, an army that's mostly focused on getting into melee, but has to butt heads against the kind of anti-melee core mechanics of the game, where charges, pilot, and consolidates are harder, melee stats are overall lower, and ranged attacks, especially with Overwatch being able to be triggered in the movement phase or in the charge phase and at a longer distance, makes it super difficult to actually engage in melee, especially against heavy shooting armies without getting shot to pieces on the way in. All that said, World Eaters definitely aren't that bad, and that's why they're not lower on this list. They certainly can put in the work by spamming Berserkers and just trying to brute force their way through their opponent, which is a very World Eater style playstyle. But again, it's a little bit unreliable. Moving on to Chaos Knights. These guys have fallen pretty far, especially since the nerfs to the Towering keyword. Knights basically got caught in the crossfire of units like Wraith Knights and Imperial Knights. They didn't have the damage output nor the survivability of Imperial Knights, but access to the Towering keyword in a large variety of extremely efficient profiles, with many of the big Knight Questoris being sub 400 points. They were able to absolutely lay the hurt down on factions that weren't able to hide from them thanks to that Towering keyword. With those chassis being wildly increased in cost in the latest balance pass, this faction has dropped precipitously, and it can focus heavily on War Dog chassis, and its War Dog walker vehicles are actually pretty efficient and have a ton of super powerful abilities, but they are not survivable, and they don't have the same access to survivability effects that Imperial Knights have, making them extremely squishy. In a metagame where multiple factions are packing enormous amounts of anti-tank, these guys just fold and don't really have the damage output to be able to compete. They are a much trixier and more interesting variety of super heavy army than Imperial Knights, but that doesn't really make them a functional fighting force. And while they aren't the worst thing in the world, most of the time you're going to be seeing Chaos Knights slotted into other Chaos factions as fire support for slightly more numerous or more efficient ground troops.
It's Ed and Trevor here. I just want to throw out a note as well that Chaos Knights have a faction ability that basically relies around battle shock checks being failed, and those faction abilities tend to be the least powerful as well. You're really depending on what your opponent's leadership characteristics are, you're depending on some random dice rolls, and there's always the chance that they insane bravery out of those battle shock checks, and your army ability does literally nothing.
Next up in the category, we have Tau Empire. And these guys have been in the headlines for a couple days now for maybe not all the right reasons, but the faction itself is still fairly functional. They've got a lot going for them with their bizarre guided mechanics and the ability to pump ridiculous amounts of damage out of their classic Crisis battlesuit bricks or large units of broadside battlesuits. They have solid characters, good support for their units, and some of the most efficient utility units in the game, with units like Vespid Stingwing, Stealth battlesuits, and Crude Hounds being able to perform actions and complete your tactical missions extremely efficiently. That said, what they do lack is basically any ability to hold primary. But this has always been the Tau problem. They really rely on crippling your opponent with their ranged attacks, and if they're not able to do that, then they'd have very little fallback plan. If you don't die to their initial shooting and they're not able to outscore you on their tactical secondaries, they have to be holding terrain, and that's not really what Tau want to do because they don't want to be close to you at all. The new changes to the battlesuit mechanics as well, making the battlesuits vehicles, is both a blessing and a curse. It allows them to overcharge their cyclic ion blasters with impunity for the most part, since they're able to roll a bunch of those dice but turn them into mortal wounds with all of their carriers for those hazardous weapons being vehicles. But on the flip side, it does mean that they are incredibly difficult to maneuver without the attachment of Cold Star commanders. It is unfortunate as well that a lot of the other units in the Tau Codex are not really seeing play besides these Crisis and Broadside battlesuits, which is super unfortunate because they do have some super cool infantry like strike teams, breacher teams, and of course their auxiliaries. That said, they can put together a functional gun line, it's relatively skirmishy, and they can get some W's with it, so they're definitely not a terrible faction, and that's why they are around the middle of the list. Now moving on to the true middle of the list, we have the Fine category. They've got some good mechanics, they've got a decent win rate, and they've got a lot of flexibility, and that puts them at right where Games Workshop kind of wants them to be. The first one we have here is Astra Militarum. Now these guys did get nerfed pretty significantly in the balance pass. Everything with the indirect fire keyword for the most part was hit pretty heftily with points increases. And unfortunately for Astra Militarum, they got caught in the crossfire of this effect. It was an army basically predicated on taking massive numbers of artillery, and unfortunately the artillery was increased to such an exorbitant cost that they really dropped a couple of percentage points, I think, in the overall rankings. With the expense of their battle tanks as well, the availability of anti-tank to Astra Militarum is a little bit tough. And because a lot of their army is these T3 infantry bricks, they don't survive very much at all. So while they are good at scoring secondary missions and they are good at pushing enemy objectives and contesting them, they are very good at surviving on them. So actually, scoring points can be a little bit of a problem for the Astra Militarum. That said, they do have a selection of some of the most effective super heavy vehicles in the entire game and can combo them off to some insane amounts of damage. They also have the ability to respawn units coming back in on the table with one-shot weapons re-equipped like Hunter Killer missiles, allowing them to recycle units like Scout Sentinels or even big bricks of 20 guardsmen at a time pretty efficiently. That's where a lot of their command points are going, and that's really where a lot of the effectiveness of the faction comes from, because they're constantly able to force their opponent to deal with their units skirmishing around the borders of the battlefield. Just like Tau Empire, however, they do have a little bit of a tough time holding primary objectives, and that is what puts them towards the bottom end of this category. Moving on, we have the Orks. These guys are probably one of the premier melee armies of 10th edition 40k. They have an incredible ability to push table space, take primary objectives, and dominate the score of the game. While their damage output isn't the greatest in the game, they make up for that in sheer numbers, with access to some of the most cheap and effective transport options in the entire game, able to fit 6 to 10 orc trucks filled with angry high OC orc infantry and ram them up the table into their opponent, backed up by ridiculously powerful smash characters that make fighting back into those bricks incredibly difficult. While this aggressive playstyle and the kind of clunkiness of their WoW mechanic do keep them back a little bit, especially against armies that are capable of dealing with their aggression, if you aren't great at scoring or good at fighting them off the primary objectives every turn, you will just straight up be outscored by orcs. And even if you can kill them and keep them off of their objectives, they will beat you when it comes to the final score. They have good access to cheap utility units like Storm Boys. Their mass transports, light vehicles can also be good at scoring secondary missions, and some of their characters like Mazrog Scragbad are incredibly tanky and super dangerous. The biggest downside to Orks is that they basically play a very fair game of Warhammer 40k. They want to shake hands with their opponent, look them in the eye, and then give them a good hard crumpin'. And if their opponent is not playing by that game plan, and instead wants to stand on their side of the table and shoot all of the Orks to death with guns, that is a little bit problematic for them. Moving on to what I think is probably the most underrated faction in 10th edition 40k, let's talk about Grey Knights. Now, the weird thing about Grey Knights is that every edition that I've seen them play in, they basically play exactly the opposite of how Grey Knight fans would want them to play. And I think that people get a little bit preoccupied with wanting Grey Knights to be the demon-hunting badasses of the 41st millennium as they're portrayed in the background, versus the timid or numerically superior Horde mode Space Marines that they end up always being. In last edition, they ended up being incredibly efficient ground troops, and you would take 60 or 70 ground Marines with strong ranged and melee attacks and good psychic powers and ram them into your opponent's army until they ran out of models to deal with you. And in 10th edition, they play a much more Eldar-style game plan. Grey Knights are hands down probably the most maneuverable army in Warhammer 40,000, full stop. With the ability to constantly be redeploying their units over the course of the game, and multiple abilities to reactively redeploy themselves, jumping back into Deep Strike when enemies move near them or attack them, and the ability to jump in on enemy objectives 3 inches away from them to steal their objectives away and complete secondary missions, Grey Knights are basically impossible to stop when it comes to outscoring their opponent. Unlike Orks, who have to stand up in the middle of the table and get shot at before they can score points, Grey Knights can simply pounce on your objectives and turn off your own scoring, and then hop away as soon as you try to reposition to deal with them. On top of that, they're also fairly difficult to kill. The entire faction has high armor saves, access to Armor of Contempt, and defensive stratagems like Smokescreen. So even when you do get line of sight, if you're not shooting them with most of your army, you're probably not killing them, and their apothecaries are going to start to get to work respawning Terminators back into their Brotherhood Terminator squads. Well, on the whole, they do have a little bit of a lack of access to good melee output, and a lot of their ranged weapons are going to be sort of high volume, low strength, low AP attacks, which make them incredibly good at killing light or medium infantry, less good at killing big tanks. The Grey Knight game plan is no longer about killing big tanks and monsters, which does feel sort of anathema to how Grey Knights are supposed to be operating, where killing greater demons is their bread and butter. But instead, they're going to avoid those greater demons, put themselves back in their teleportariums, and then steal all the primary objectives away so that the demons, I guess, just get tired and go home. It's weird and idiosyncratic and probably will take some getting used to by the Grey Knights player base, but it's undoubtedly effective, and Grey Knights have been seeing a steady increase in their play and win rates since the edition began. Now, speaking of Grey Knights, it would be a travesty not to pair them next to their ancient nemesis, the Chaos Demons. I said in a recent live stream I thought it was pretty interesting that Grey Knights and Chaos Demons actually have a very similar playstyle, because why would the Grey Knights not adopt the tactics of their enemy in order to defeat them? Chaos Demons, very much like Grey Knights, have some incredible maneuverability options. Their Shadow of Chaos effect allows them to heal themselves, pull them back into Deep Strike, and redeploy themselves close to enemy models, and even have the ability to charge afterwards without really much ability for the enemy to stop them. If they're able to do this unfettered, they can play a very similar game plan to the Grey Knights, constantly pulling their models off the table, throwing them onto enemy objectives, scoring tactical secondary objectives incredibly quickly, and stealing primary objectives out from under their feet. Combo that with some pretty solid ranged attacks from units like Soul Grinders or Lords of Change, including Kairos Fateweaver, and some pretty strong melee threats as well, like a Bloodthirster wielding Argath, the King of Blades, or Shalaxi Hellbane, the character Keeper of Secrets. This makes them into much more of a beat stick faction than Grey Knights could ever be. They have good damage output, but less survivability and less reactive effect. Instead, they're more going to be centered around standing on the table and slowly moving around to manipulate their Shadow of Chaos in order to get themselves into good positions to Deep Strike. Fortunately for them, the inclusion of Be'lakor in the faction basically makes the entire machine tick, and unfortunately for the faction, it does sort of require that you take Be'lakor these days. He's basically stapled into the Chaos Demons index and comes stock every time you open Battlescribe and create a Chaos Demons roster, but he does do a good job at projecting your Shadow of Chaos, allowing your units to push up the table, take new objectives, and constantly be redeploying around the table. Sort of similar to Grey Knights, it doesn't really feel like the Chaos Demons game plan, especially since in 9th edition they were the big melee beatsticks of the metagame. You would just throw greater demons into people's armies and watch them explode things until they finally ran out of energy and died. But in 10th edition, they're going to be playing a lot more of a capricious and manipulative game plan, pulling the strings of the galaxy from behind the scenes, as it were. Now moving on, we can probably have what I think in some instances was probably the most overrated army of 10th edition Warhammer 40k. A lot of people said that these guys would be literally unstoppable, and that did not end up being the case. Although they are still incredibly powerful, which puts the Thousand Sons towards the top of this mid-tier category. Thousand Sons are definitely one of the more complex armies in Warhammer 40k, both to understand, play, and play against. They have ridiculous battlefield manipulation thanks to those Kabbalistic rituals, able to pump out damage, protect protect themselves with layers of 0 damage attacks, save rerolls, and other defensive effects, or even just move huge units 60 inches across the table in ways that feel literally unstoppable. With a high pool of Kabbalistic rituals, the amount of damage or maneuverability the Thousand Suns army is able to produce at any one turn is in some cases unparalleled, but it's mostly focused on toughness for regular Space Marines who don't really have much else going for them besides some situational wound rerolls. That said, Magnus the Red is an incredible reason to take the faction. The Demon Primarch of the Thousand Suns is probably one of the most powerful single models in the entire game and carries the entirety of the Thousand Suns roster in most matchups. Alongside large bricks of Rubric Marines and even Scarab Occult Terminators, to add some additional threats, battlefield control, and just raw volume of fire, Thousand Suns can put out an appreciable amount of damage with a lot of wound bonuses and rerolls to up the value of their usually strength 4 low value attacks. They're certainly, I think, one of the better armies in 40k, and while they don't have a great track record against the top stuff in the game, they are flexible enough to play into a lot of it. And that moves us on to the end of the fine tier, the top of the mid-range, I guess, Tyranids. Now, I'll criticize myself on this one. This was certainly my most underrated faction of 10th edition. The big thing that Tyranids have going for them is ridiculous access to objective scoring. Honestly, one thing that I didn't entirely internalize was the fact that with their Spore Mine generation mechanics, Tyranids can create units anywhere on the table that they want to, that aren't screened out by enemy models, which, when you are playing tactical objectives or even trying to score fixed objectives, means that they are essentially unparalleled in secondary objective scoring. While Tyranids can be relatively tanky, they aren't the most difficult to kill things in the world, and Tyranids will sometimes struggle to hold on to primary objectives, but it is a rare game where a Tyranid player does not max their secondary objectives by the end of the game. And that in and of itself is an incredible boon to the faction. On top of that, they basically have some of the most efficient data sheets available to anyone in Warhammer 40k. While their base profiles do suffer a little bit, Tyranids are very much playing Horde mode 40k. Not only do you literally get units for free in this faction by spawning them out of Biovores or Sporocysts, you also figuratively get units by them just costing functionally no points. Units like Barbagons and Neuragons are a drop in the bucket when it comes to creating an army, and large beatsticks like Maliceptors and Horospexes are probably undercosted when compared to similar profiles around the rest of 40k. And while they're slow, kind of tepid, and difficult to maneuver into melee, their low cost and spammability very much makes up for those deficits. On the whole, it places Tyranids as an incredibly grindy army with a lot of forward momentum, but some of the most consistent scoring in 40k, which again is how you win games. So while it is possible to shoot Tyranid armies off the table or outmaneuver them, they will most likely score highly on most of their games, and in most matchups will eventually win on points. Now we're moving on to the good tier. These guys are good. I don't know what else to say about them. Of the middle of the road armies in Warhammer 40k, these guys are the upper crust, and if we were to see the nerf hammer descend like the wrath of the gods above on the top factions of the game, these guys would become that upper crust. That said, they are not undefeatable by the factions below them, and with some good smart play they can be defeated, and they don't have perfect matchups into everything. And the first one on the list is Chaos Space Marines. This faction is almost entirely carried by two things: the incredible flexibility of the Dark Pact mechanic and its incredible synergy within the Servants of Darkness detachment, being able to gain additional benefits from the Marks of Chaos assigned to the models in the army, and their ridiculously powerful stratagems. Chaos Space Marine stratagems do everything from give you full rerolls to hit and wound, allow you to advance and charge, or make you entirely immune to enemy ranged attacks. The combination of these effects is ridiculous, and when combined with their ability to regenerate command points either from enhancements or Abaddon the Despoiler, does give them an incredible leg up in a lot of matchups. On top of that, they're able to project shooting power with units like Obliterators and Forge Fiends that most other gunline armies in the game can't really deal with, and with their Dark Obscuration protecting them from incoming ranged attacks on their most important key units, they're extremely difficult to win a fight against. You can stack on top of that efficient frontline troops like Accursed Cultists or Chaos Chosen, and these guys basically just have it coming and going. I don't know what else to say about these guys. They might not be the fastest thing in the game, although they do have some pretty reasonable threat ranges. They just shoot real good, they punch also real good, and they survive pretty good as well. And all those together creates the picture of a faction that's just real good. I don't know. That's why they're in the good tier. Just like we ended up with Chaos Demons and Grey Knights right next to each other, we actually have a little bit of another dark mirror here with Adeptus Astartes being next to Chaos Space Marines. Now, I'm committing a little bit of a faux pas here by combining all of the Space Marine sub-factions into a single super faction just for my own convenience, but largely most factions in Space Marines are going to be playing within a Gladius task force. So at their basal level, at the lowest power level a Space Marine sub-faction can possibly be, it will be as powerful as the most mediocre Gladius task force, which, to be clear, is probably one of the best single detachments in the game. Battle host notwithstanding, the Aeldari are ridiculous. But Space Marines have an incredible toolbox. And while some Space Marine chapters like Death Watch in particular do have incredible utility by themselves, they and Gladius Task Force are probably going to be interchangeable in a lot of situations. While I do think Death Watch in the hands of a very good player are probably more powerful thanks to their ability to maneuver around the table and the enhancements granted by the detachment, Gladius Task Force just has probably one of the deepest toolboxes of any detachment in the game. And that's what makes Space Marines super good. While they do have a selection of fairly efficient units, they do lack for a little bit of frontline presence, however, make up for that by just ludicrously efficient shooting. Units like Gladiator Lancers are able to put extremely strong anti-tank shooting downrange. They have decent indirect fire between Whirlwinds, and Desolator Marines, probably the best indirect fire platform in the game. They also have decent secondary scoring with good utility units like Infiltrators, Scout Snipers, and Inceptors, which are probably one of the strongest deep striking options in Warhammer 40k. Assembled all together, and these guys basically just have a very deep toolbox of incredibly strong units that can be used efficiently, and all of which is made very effective thanks to the Oath of Moment army rule. They can back that up with good characters, strong character synergy, decent melee attacks, and make an altogether all-rounder faction that is great at shooting and creates an amazing gun line. They do fall apart a little bit when it comes to melee. They don't really have that many extremely strong melee options, but moving into sub-factions like Dark Angels or Ultramarines does get you access to Primarchs like Rabuta Gilliman or the Lion, and that can help to support that late game damage output with some powerful melee attacks. You can also fit in Bulwark units like Aggressors or Terminators in some instances and use those to fill that role as well. Turns out having a faction with literally hundreds of datasheets in it means that you do have a deep well of tools to fall back on, and they use it to great effect, and that's why they put them in the good tier. Next up, we have Imperial Knights, and these guys I think have fallen pretty precipitously again since the nerfs to towering units. Now, the towering mechanic didn't change at all, and Imperial Knights are still one of the best users of the mechanic, but all of the units that they were relying on to do that damage increased dramatically in points cost. We saw 15 to 20% increases in cost for most of the heavy Knight units in the entire game. That said, Knights have survived relatively unscathed, and while they do fall apart into some matchups, especially matchups with extremely strong melee that can punish Knights for moving aggressively onto mid-board objectives, they have very good shooting to back it up, and especially with the introduction of the Imperial Armor Indexes, they got new tools like the Serasis Knight Lancer and the Castigator, both of which have incredible bondsman abilities that are able to both support their armatures and themselves as well. That gives them a good baseline of shooting. They have Armature Helverins, which are extremely effective, especially if they're able to trigger their anti-fly ability, and they have good defensive effects like built-in Feel No Pains and damage reduction from Knight Wardens that can keep their armatures around and putting their ridiculously high OC8 on objectives for as long as big robotically possible. While Knights do run into a lot of bad matchups, just given the fact that they're an army that consists entirely of giant robots, and if you're good at killing giant robots, you'll be good at killing them. They can also power through a lot of those by just virtue of the fact that they can shoot most of the things on the table thanks to towering, and are very difficult to kill on the swingback. While Knight's biggest weakness is the ability to be outscored, unlike a lot of the factions that we've talked about having incredibly strong scoring mechanics, Knights really lack that, and the introduction or inclusion of Imperial Agents and units like Exaction Squads and Assassins can certainly help shore up that deficiency. It doesn't go all the way, and Knights will find themselves an inability to score some secondary objectives when it comes to the late game. But for an army that's generally speaking very effective when it comes to trading blows with enemy armies, Knights are still doing pretty well for themselves. Moving on to the last couple in the good tier, we have Necrons. These guys have started to trend upwards pretty steadily, which I do appreciate because I do think they've been slept on. Necrons are resilience made manifest in silvery necrodermis and living metal. They are able to slowly but steadily trudge across the table, supported by fire from ridiculous fire platforms like Doomsday Arks, and basically be unkillable for the vast majority of armies in the game. It is a rare occurrence that a Necron brick, like a warrior unit or a Lich Guard unit, is killed by the opponent, and generally speaking, the correct tactical play is to try as hard as you can not to roll attacks against them, because doing so is an exercise in utter futility and will send you to an early grave. So on top of that tankiness and domination of primary objectives with the ability to just put high OC, incredibly difficult to kill units on center objectives and hold them for the majority of the game, they also have access to incredibly strong utility units. Units like Tomb Blades and a Sempiternal Weaved Transcendent Catan can pop around the table very quickly, are themselves still difficult to kill, and have the speed to complete your secondary missions. Really, the toolbox for Necrons is a lot deeper in this edition than it has been in past editions, and they use that to great effect. They are lacking a little bit in terms of threat range. While they can advance and fire their weapons with a stratagem, they don't have any way to increase their melee threat range, and the units that their ranged attacks are attached to tend to be big and kind of difficult to maneuver. That makes not engaging with the Necron army usually the most effective game plan against them. It creates a dynamic of trying to avoid Necrons and contain them as much as possible rather than try to kill them, and while some factions can potentially actually kill the Necron bricks, it usually takes so much effort that you will have lost the game to the other units shooting you long before you actually do meaningful damage to them. So it's no wonder that these guys are slowly trending up in their results in game. And with that, we'll move on to the end of the good tier with the Golden Boys, the Adeptus. These guys came out swinging in 10th edition, and I think while a lot of people were focused on the really heavy gun lines of the faction, post nerfs to the Towering keyword and some of the nerfs to the top factions in the game that could keep a good Custodian down, Custodes have just continued to plod along in their golden armor, slowly marching up the table and being impregnable to enemy assaults. Well, I mentioned already that the Space Marine Oaths of Moment mechanic and Cast Space Marine stratagem, both giving them rerolls, are incredibly strong. It turns out having a faction that essentially rerolls everything for all of their attacks is really good, and it makes Custodes the #1 melee damage output faction in the entire game. While they don't have back-breaking shooting, they do have good anti-infantry firepower with units like Alaris Custodians and Custodian Guard that are able to shoot multiple times per phase, and they do have good anti-tank in their Caladius Grav tanks as well. The downside that Custodes have is a little bit of a lack of maneuverability. However, they did take some tips from their Silver Brethren and can now use their Teleportariums to bounce their units around the table, especially Alaris Terminator units, with more alacrity than they did in past editions. This gives them a little bit of maneuverability, and they can attach characters like models with the Ceaseless Hunter enhancement or Blade Champions to increase the mobility of their relatively slow infantry bricks even more, which can allow them to get up the table faster than they did in previous editions. They back that up with incredibly strong defensive profiles and are difficult to kill efficiently for most armies in the game. Especially units like Custodian Wardens are basically uninteractable by a single phase. You have to be able to kill them over multiple phases so that their layers of defensive mechanics like wound penalties and feel no pains don't stack up on top of you and entirely ruin the stats of your ranged weapons. Well, they are another faction that can in some instances have a little bit of difficulty scoring tactical secondaries because they don't have a great swath of models outside of Imperial Agent support. They make up for that by being very, very strong in primary objectives. Being one of the few armies that's able to basically break cover and run into the middle of the table without fearing much for their lives. Most gun lines in the game can't kill them effectively, and any melee army that's trying to engage with them is just going to be killed by a mass of always fighting first Custodian Guards. While they're certainly not unbeatable, I will say that even factions that have a good matchup into them, and even factions at the top end of the tier list that we'll be talking about here, do have to play a pretty good game to defeat Adeptus Custodes. And Custodes will give basically any faction in the game a good run for their money. And with that, let's move to the very top. These guys are easy mode, although not really. We have Genestealer Cults and Aeldari, and these have been discussed as the top two factions of Warhammer 40k for a while, but I do think that the gap between them is steadily widening. Eldar, since the release of the edition, have been the undisputed masters of 10th edition, with some of the most effective ranged attacks in the game, wide access to mortal wound generation from devastating wounds, extremely strong access to reroll, rerolls with characters like Farseers, granting them to units, and floating rerolls from their detachment ability across the entire game, plus dice manipulation from Strands of Fate. They create a gun line of wildly efficient ranged attacks that are able to back up relatively tanky units, and good multi-role units that can basically perform well in any matchup. Even the armies that could potentially threaten them get knocked down by their powerful maneuverability effects. Things like Phantasm and Fire and Fade make it very difficult to actually capitalize on an Eldar player being too aggressive with you. While Eldar have been nerfed slightly and some of their most powerful and abusive units have gotten a tone down, I think the core mechanics of the faction are really giving the rest of the units in it a huge leg up, and they're gonna need a pretty deep rework in order to bring them down from the pedestal of power that they're currently sitting at. Now, Genestealer Cults are a very different story. These guys are ridiculously powerful when played to their full capacity. It was called out by a lot of people when the faction was originally spoiled in the 10th edition faction focus articles. Turns out the ability to respawn your units almost infinitely over the course of the game is really, really good. It turns out that also having some of the best trading units with some of the best spike damage output in the game means that recycling those units is one of the most effective strategies you can come up with. Genestealer Cults get incredible bonuses when they're set up on the table, and they can use characters like Nexos and their stratagems alongside support units like Achilles Ridge Runners to combo themselves together to get ridiculous damage output. You can have a 160-point unit of Neophyte hybrids, putting out a grand total of 28 functionally strength 11 or 12 AP3 D3 damage gunshots with rerolls to hit and ignoring cover. These guys basically shred almost any defensive profile in the entire game, and while they themselves are incredibly squishy, and get wiped out immediately once they're on the table, their Cult Ambush ability means that they just re-enter Deep Strike and perform the combo again next turn. While they have been nerfed a little bit, and their ability to abuse objective scoring by bringing models out of Cult Ambush in long strings back to their Cult Ambush token to then steal people's objectives away has been nerfed, they still are very efficient. And if you don't have a way to interact with their Cult Ambush tokens and force them to try to protect those, they can still be regenerating units into the middle of the table directly back into the fight. They did get as well a little bit of a bump in their power level with their Acolyte hybrids and their Demolition Charge units able to respawn with restocked Demolition Charges. Previously, those were only one-shot weapons and could only be used once a game, even if you died and were then respawned, but that has been reversed. So you have a truly Horde mode army that plays hundreds of models, has incredible damage output, ridiculous character synergies, and almost unstoppable objective control. So what are the downsides? And I think the real problem is that operating these armies with hundreds and hundreds of models effectively and efficiently can go wrong very quickly. Enemies that have deep strike denial or good manipulation of your Cult Ambush tokens can easily abuse Genestealer Cult players that aren't necessarily prepared for the matchup, and they can lose their Cult Ambush tokens and permanently lose their units fairly easily. On top of that, in some competitive events, timing restrictions are in place, and Genestealer Cult players do have to play in a timed game, and when you're playing with upwards of 300 models in a game that have to be picked up, reorganized, set back up on the table, have attacks rolled for, saves rolled for on the swing back, it can make Genestealer Cults an incredibly time-consuming army to play as well, especially once those units are set on the table and begin moving, charging, and performing pilot and consolidation moves. You have to be an incredibly strong player to be successful with Genestealer Cults, not only mechanically in 40k, but also practice with the army and able to operate it in an efficient manner. Now, whether or not that's a healthy thing for the game, I think is yet to be seen, and while it does mean that Genestealer Cults don't see the same easy success that Eldar do, it does mean that in some situations, players who are a Genestealer Cult fanatic can be rewarded for their loyalty. Having a high skill cap faction is definitely no bad thing for the game, and I think factions that reward players for playing them well are super cool and super fun. But having those factions also be wild Horde mode factions with unlimited models can be a little bit problematic, because I do think that the burnout effect is real. And with that, that is all of the factions in Warhammer 40k. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. This was a bit of a marathon, so let me know if you enjoy these regular tier list updates and if you agree with me on my selections. Thanks to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, that makes these long form videos possible. Also, YouTube channel members, you can join in the link down below the video, and Twitch subscribers, all you people are great, and I love you, and I want to throw a shout out to the Magnet Baron as well for sponsoring this video. They've been a huge supporter of the channel, so please go check them out at themagnetbaron.com. There will be a link down in the video description as well. I really appreciate it. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.